The rookie nurse never imagined that one silent gesture at an airport terminal would make a powerful hospital CO freeze mid-sentence miles away. But that morning, as she pressed two trembling fingers to her wrist and locked eyes with a decorated SEAL commander across the crowded concourse, everything she had been fighting to survive was about to change. The departure board flickered above the bustling halls of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, announcing delays and final calls while travelers hurried past rolling suitcases and echoing announcements, completely unaware that a quiet exchange was unfolding in plain sight. Avery Bennett stood near gate C-12 clutching the strap of her worn medical bag, her scrubs hidden beneath a light sweater, exhaustion lining her face after another sleepless night at Westbridge Medical Center, where rookie nurses were expected to function like seasoned veterans, and fear of administrative reprimand hung heavier than the scent of antiseptic in the hallways. She was only 24, 6 months into her first official nursing position, and already she felt as though she were walking a tightrope stretched between her lifelong dream of healing others and the crushing weight of policies that seemed designed to punish initiative rather than protect it. Just days earlier, she had stood in an emergency room trauma bay with alarms blaring and a teenage patient struggling for air after a sudden anaphylactic collapse, senior physicians tied up in another crisis, seconds ticking away like a countdown she could almost hear, and Avery had acted. Not recklessly, not carelessly, but decisively, administering treatment exactly as she had been trained during disaster volunteer work years before, saving the boy's life, but failing to complete one procedural notification before doing so. The next morning, she received a formal disciplinary warning signed personally by CEO Richard Calloway, a man known for sharp suits, tighter budgets, and a leadership style built on efficiency metrics rather than human stories. And though no one said it outright, the message was clear: follow the chain of command or risk your future. That warning had followed her home each night like a shadow, joining the greater fear she carried for her mother, whose worsening kidney condition required specialized treatment out of state. The reason Avery now stood in this airport trying to appear composed while panic clawed at her ribs. She had nearly given up on nursing once before, growing up in a struggling neighborhood where her mother worked double shifts cleaning office buildings and electricity sometimes flickered out mid-homework session. Avery studied by borrowed light and volunteered at free clinics just to feel closer to the future she wanted, believing stubbornly that compassion could be stronger than circumstance. It was during one of those volunteer deployments, years earlier after catastrophic flooding along the Gulf Coast, that she had first met then-Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hale, a calm, steady presence in a chaotic triage tent where civilians and service members worked side by side. He had noticed the determined teenager refusing to step away despite blistered feet and shaking hands, and instead of dismissing her, he taught her how to assess shock, how to slow her breathing when fear surged, how to prioritize when resources were thin, and before his unit redeployed, he shared a subtle signal used among field medics when verbal communication wasn't safe. 2 fingers pressed lightly to the inner wrist, meaning I recognize you, I need help, I trust you. She never thought she would use it again. Yet as she shifted her weight near gate C-12 that morning, she saw him. Older now, broader in the shoulders, dressed in full uniform, scanning the crowd with the same alert focus she remembered. And for a split second she wondered if she was mistaken. But when his eyes met hers, something in his expression told her she wasn't. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain nearby travelers could hear it. Over the overhead announcements, and without fully deciding to do so, Avery raised her hand and pressed 2 fingers to her wrist before lowering her gaze, a motion so slight it vanished into the blur of passing passengers. Commander Hale's posture changed instantly, subtle but unmistakable, as recognition dawned, not just of her face, but of the desperation behind the gesture. And while no one else in the terminal noticed anything unusual, the air between them seemed to tighten with unspoken understanding. Avery looked away quickly, embarrassed by her own boldness, unsure whether she had just overstepped or misread him entirely. But within moments, he began walking toward her with the controlled stride of someone accustomed to high-stakes environments. She felt suddenly small, aware of the unpaid bills folded inside her bag, the warning letter that threatened her probationary status, the quiet fear that one more misstep would send her back to the beginning after everything she had sacrificed. And yet beneath that anxiety flickered a fragile thread of hope. Not for rescue exactly, but for validation, for someone to confirm that acting to save a life had not been a mistake. Around them, families laughed, phones chimed, boarding calls echoed, and somewhere else in the airport, so Richard Calloway was making his way toward a connecting flight, unaware that a conversation sparked by a nearly invisible signal was about to challenge the very system he believed was working flawlessly. Avery drew in a steadying breath as Commander Hale stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes softening with recognition. And in that charged, ordinary airport moment, she realized that sometimes the smallest gesture, a silent plea carried across a crowded room, can set into motion consequences powerful enough to reach boardrooms and corner offices, powerful enough to make even the most confident leader pause. And though she did not yet know it, the decision she had made in that emergency room and the signal she had just given were about to collide in a way that would reshape far more than her own fragile career. The quiet exchange at Gate C-12 would soon travel far beyond the walls of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. But in that moment, Avery Bennett only felt the tremor in her hands as Commander Marcus Hale stopped in front of her and said her name with calm certainty. Years had passed since the flood relief camp where she had been a stubborn, wide-eyed teenager refusing to leave a triage station, and he had been the officer who noticed her determination and taught her how to think clearly under pressure. Yet the instant she used that field signal, 2 fingers pressed to her wrist, he understood she wouldn't have done so unless something was truly wrong. They moved to a quieter stretch of the terminal, and Avery told him everything in a controlled voice that threatened to crack. Her mother's worsening kidney failure, the crushing debt, and the disciplinary warning she had received at Westbridge Medical Center after acting without formal authorization during a life-threatening emergency. She described the teenage patient whose airway had begun to close, the absence of a supervising physician, and the split-second decision to intervene based on her trauma training. The same kind of training Hale had once reinforced, a decision that saved a life but violated a minor reporting protocol. The warning had been signed personally by CEO Richard Calloway, and though no one had said it outright, she knew another misstep could cost her job. Hale listened without interruption, his expression steady but tightening as she described a workplace culture where young nurses feared punishment more than mistakes, where initiative felt dangerous and silence felt safer. He asked only precise questions, clarifying timelines and procedures, and when she finished, he understood that this wasn't recklessness. It was courage under pressure. By coincidence, Richard Calloway was also in that airport, heading to a healthcare leadership summit, reviewing notes about efficiency and compliance when Hale requested a brief private conversation. At first, the CEO responded with polished courtesy, but his composure shifted as the commander calmly recounted the emergency in clinical detail, the collapsing airway, the seconds that mattered, the intervention that stabilized the patient before permanent damage could occur. Calloway referenced liability and adherence to protocol, insisting systems existed to protect both staff and patients. But Hale countered with measured conviction, explaining that in military medicine, decisive action grounded in training is not insubordination but responsibility. Then he added a fact Calloway did not expect. The patient Avery saved was the grandson of a major philanthropic donor family, one that had later sent a letter praising the young nurse who refused to hesitate, unaware that she had been formally reprimanded days later. The implications settled heavily between them, not merely financial, but ethical, and for the first time Calloway considered that his policies might be cultivating fear rather than excellence. He imagined a hospital floor where nurses waited for signatures while monitors flatlined, and the thought unsettled him more than any compliance report ever had. Meanwhile, back near the boarding line, Avery sat beside her mother, who rested quietly with a travel blanket around her shoulders, unaware that a conversation was unfolding that could determine her daughter's future. Avery questioned whether reaching out had been foolish, whether invoking a signal rooted in trust had crossed an invisible boundary. Yet beneath the anxiety, she felt something steadier, the reminder that she had acted to save a life, not to defy authority. When Hale returned, he offered no dramatic reassurances, only a firm nod and the quiet statement that integrity has a way of surfacing, even in boardrooms. and as boarding announcements echoed through the terminal, three paths were beginning to converge. A rookie nurse fighting to protect her career, a commander unwilling to ignore courage, and a CEO facing the possibility that the system he built might need more than efficiency to truly save lives. By the time the planes landed and the conference concluded, the quiet conversation at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport had already begun to ripple through corridors far more powerful than Avery Bennett could imagine. She returned to her shifts at Westbridge Medical Center expecting nothing to change, preparing herself for scrutiny, bracing for another reminder that she was replaceable. But instead she was summoned to the executive floor late one afternoon, her pulse unsteady as she stepped into the office of CEO Richard Calloway. She stood straight, ready to defend her actions one final time. Yet Calloway surprised her by rising from behind his desk, his expression no longer distant or clinical but thoughtful, almost measured in a different way. He informed her that her disciplinary warning had been rescinded after a full review of the emergency incident, acknowledging that her intervention had directly contributed to saving the patient's life, and that initiative grounded in training should not be mistaken for defiance. There was no dramatic apology, no sweeping speech. Only a quiet admission that leadership sometimes requires listening, and that systems designed for safety must also leave room for courage. Avery felt the tension she had carried for weeks loosen in her chest, not because her record was cleared, but because someone in power had finally recognized the intent behind her actions. Calloway went further, authorizing access to an internal medical assistance fund to help with her mother's treatment and announcing upcoming adjustments to emergency response policy to better protect nurses who made good faith decisions under pressure. The change did not transform the hospital overnight, but it began a shift in tone. Staff meetings where frontline voices were heard more openly, mentorship programs pairing experienced physicians with new nurses, conversations about balancing accountability with trust. Commander Marcus Hale returned to duty without seeking credit, sending Avery only a brief handwritten note that arrived days later in her locker. Courage doesn't depend on rank. You already had it. She read the words twice, then folded the paper carefully, understanding that the signal she had given at the airport had not been a plea for rescue, but a reminder of who she was, a nurse who chose action when it mattered. Months passed, her mother's health stabilized, and Avery grew steadier in her role, mentoring incoming nurses who arrived wide-eyed and uncertain just as she once had. Whenever one of them hesitated during training scenarios, she would quietly tell them that fear is natural, but compassion must be stronger. The moment that had nearly broken her career became the foundation of her confidence, and no few people ever knew how close the hospital had come to losing her. The culture within its walls slowly reflected the lesson learned that day. In the end, nothing about the airport scene had been loud or dramatic. No raised voices, no public confrontation, just a subtle gesture, a private conversation, and a leader willing to reconsider his perspective. Yet that was enough to change the trajectory of a young nurse's life and remind a powerful executive that healthcare is not built solely on policies and protection from liability, but on human beings willing to act when seconds count. And sometimes, all it takes to spark that realization is the smallest signal, given at exactly the right moment.